So I've just watched Bring Her Back, and to be honest, I think this could be my favourite horror movie that A24 has done since the likes of Midsommar and Hereditary. This wasn't just a horror film, this was a movie that had deeper themes embedded within it that made you question everything that you were looking at. It tackled grief, the lengths that the bereaved are willing to go to in order to bring a loved one back, trauma along with how it can often repeat itself and how love can transform somebody into a monster. This was a prime example of a horror that didn't need jump scares, it just used visuals, audio, and made you use your mind to bring out the true horror of what was occurring. So let's dive into this movie and break down the deeper meaning of the ending. Here is a breakdown of Bring Her Back. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The deeper meaning. When it comes to the deeper meaning of this movie, it's clear to see that outside of the horror element of it, it was telling the story of a woman called Laura who was struggling with grief and was driven to the point of becoming a monstrous version of herself due to losing her daughter, Kathy, to the point where she was going to kill another with the hopes of bringing her daughter back. She kidnapped a young boy named Connor Bird, who she was making out was called Ollie, and through the possessive cult, there was this demon that was promising to bring her daughter back by purging the soul from her dead body that was in the freezer, and hoping to put it into Piper. Piper was essentially a mirror of Kathy, which was summed up most in this shot here, where it flipped, and Laura had essentially molded her into her deceased daughter. But with her being of a similar age, both being visually impaired, Laura also putting her hair in a certain way that Kathy used to have it, asking her to call her mum and also putting her in the cardigan that Kathy used to wear. She wanted the girl that she was going to sacrifice to be as close to her daughter as possible. This story was actually a really sad one at its core because it showed the limits that losing a child could ultimately drive somebody to. Prior to losing Kathy, Laura was a counsellor for over 20 years and she was considered to be one of the best, to the point where nobody would have expected her to have acted like that. But in losing her child, it changed her completely, and we saw the lengths that she was willing to be driven to if it meant that she'd get her daughter back. Murder, abuse, killing a long-term friend, and even kidnapping multiple children. I feel like this movie showed that if grief isn't handled in the correct way, then it can quite literally turn you into a monster. Ollie wasn't the monster in this movie, nor the demonic nature that he had. It was Laura. Everything bad that was happening was because it was being driven by her and the grief that was motivating her. She wore her pain, but in a way that made her somebody that was unrecognizable. Right at the end of the movie, when she was drowning Piper with the hopes of getting Kathy to return, it was actually Piper calling her mum which stopped her from going through with it and ultimately saved Piper. All Laura wanted was to hear herself being called mum one more time by her daughter, which is what she mentioned earlier on in the movie. And that very word, mum, something that she wasn't to anybody anymore, held such weight and power to the point where it silenced her grief. She saw herself killing her own daughter in that moment, and that prevented her from going through with it. The fact that it was in the very spot where she tried to save her daughter originally as well, but it being the spot where she was now killing somebody who reflected her daughter in the way that she looked. It was as if in that moment, her mindset was transported back to where it was before she got into all of this mess with the cult and turned into the monstrous being. The sad reality of it all was that this was just a story of a woman who missed her daughter. She loved her daughter deeply, and you could see that with the way that the rug was still taped down to the floor and how Kathy's room was untouched. It showed that she wasn't ready to move on. She just couldn't accept that she'd been killed in a way that was out of her control, and that was reflected in all of her actions. Another core theme that was explored was that of abuse and how it shapes people. The shower was a motif that was constantly used as a way of bringing to light the abuse that Andy had faced throughout his whole life. We found out that he was jealous and he hated the fact that he didn't get any attention because it was all given to Piper. Pair that with the fact that he used to get hit by his father whilst the shower was running so that Piper couldn't hear, and then with his father also dying in the shower. It made that environment a place which quite literally haunted his mind. However, alongside bringing to light the suffering that Andy had been through, we also saw the sheer amount of love that he had for his sister, and that, like how Laura would do anything in order to bring back her daughter Kathy, on the flip side, we saw how Andy was willing to quite literally do anything to protect his sister. And sadly, he ultimately paid the highest price of them all, which was death, as he died at the hands of Laura. Andy was neglected throughout his whole life, and it was sad to see that even when he arrived at Laura's house, he was being pushed out of the picture immediately. and quite literally with Laura getting in the way of him in the photo. The theme of the lengths that people can get driven to for love and also grief was mirrored on both sides of the story with Andy and Laura. On one side, they turned into a monster, and on the other side, they turned into a protector. The focus on those deeper themes and the decision to allow them to take center stage made this horror movie hit differently, and it worked in a way that made me feel for the villain in all of this right at the end. You felt her grief, and despite her doing all of those horrific things, you could see the pain that she was in. It was an exceptional focal point. Bring Her Back's ending explained. The ending of this movie was one that I thought hit really hard. Not only did we see Oliver return to be Connor Bird and recognize himself after stepping outside of the circle, which meant that the demonic nature wouldn't have control. This was also after being reminded who he was due to the missing persons poster, which then tied back as to why he wrote down Bird on a piece of paper earlier. But we also saw that Piper found out that Laura had killed her brother, and that Laura was also planning on killing her so that she could bring back her daughter. However, following Piper calling Laura mum, which I explained earlier, she managed to escape and was saved by a car that was driving past. As she was sitting in the car, she looked up to the sky and she could hear the plane that was flying in the air. The plane was symbolic of somebody that had died flying by and going to heaven. This happened after the funeral for their father, and it happening here was symbolic of her feeling as though Andy was with her as he was going into the afterlife. When it came to the end of Laura though, we saw that her mindset was transported back to being a mother after Piper called her that, and as she went to get Kathy from the freezer, there were home videos of her waking her daughter up from sleep, which is exactly what this entire movie was basically about, and it was intercut with her going to Kathy in the freezer and seeing her lifeless body. As she looked over at her, she was in tears, and to be honest, that was a moment that did hit really hard. It hit hard because even though this person had done some horrific things, we saw the true Laura in this moment. The one that wasn't blinded by grief, but the one that had accepted that she was never getting her daughter back. She was in tears and she just broke down. The final shot of the entirety of this movie was of Laura cradling her daughter in the swimming pool within a circle, and her being driven to the point where she ended things for herself simply showed that she couldn't carry on living without her daughter. The grief was too much, and the idea of bringing her daughter back was now something that was never going to happen, if it was even ever going to happen at all. My review of the movie. I thought this wasn't only a great horror movie, but it was an immersive, heartbreaking tale of a woman who was grieving the most important person in her life. This wasn't horror in the traditional sense, where you're being made to jump constantly, or you're worried about what's lurking around the corner. This was a horror movie because of the blood and gore, but also because it tackled one of the most horrific things that could happen to a mother, losing a child. So by having that topic being at the center of the movie, it just made for some true horrific viewing. The performances by all of the cast members in this film was just exceptional. I saw loads of marketing videos where people were discussing Sally Hawkins' performance as Laura, and it made me a bit skeptical because I then started to expect something incredible, but it genuinely went above and beyond that. We saw a woman blinded by grief and willing to go to extreme levels to bring her back. She was chaotically and erratically overbearing, and she was frightening to watch. She was obsessed, and the idea of being in a room alone with her was something that would send shivers down my spine. It was one of the strongest performances in a horror movie since Toni Collette in Hereditary. Then, when it came to Piper and Andy, their dynamic of being a brother and sister was something that I just bought into instantly. The level of care that Andy had and the fact that he was willing to do anything to protect her was evident, so when he was killed, I was gutted. The way that it was done as well, by not even seeing Laura, but just those hands going over his head and then just turning his head slowly. It hit so hard and I felt so bad for him. We were made to believe that Andy was going to be this hero, so by surprising us in having him die, it was a bold but great move from the writers. Some of the horror scenes in this movie were genuinely petrifying. Like I've said a countless number of times in this video, this wasn't about jump scares, but where this movie liked to make us look away was in the visual horror. So the likes of Oliver being with the cat, the chewing on the knife, the biting on the table, and the flaying of his own skin. All of this was just utterly horrific to look at, but most importantly, horrific to listen to as well. I found myself looking away at points and covering my mouth because I was in shock at what I was watching, so it worked really well. Gradually seeing Oliver turn more and more demonic too, he was unrecognizable by the end, and that was a horrific sight to look at. Even though Laura was the baddie in the movie, right at the end, I felt the pain that she was in and I could sympathize with her pain. So the movie did a phenomenal job at bringing it right back to reality right at the end. It showed the pain that she was in and it showed that she just missed her daughter and she wanted to bring her back. The blending of the home video when she woke her daughter up, paired with her looking at her lifeless body in the freezer that she just wished that she was able to wake up, it was just heartbreaking and it hit home the reasoning as to why she was acting the way that she was, because she had the most horrific thing happen to her. That final shot of the movie with both Laura and Kathy being inside of the circle whilst floating in the pool, mother cradling daughter, it was an image that just summed up what this entire movie was about. No words needed to be spoken because that final shot said it all. Love, grief, upset, and death. It drove her to the point of no return, a woman that was once respected amongst her peers and would never act in the way that she did, but there she was, acting like a different person. Grief changes people, and if it's not handled in the correct way, then you can become unrecognizable, and that's exactly what happened with Laura. I think this is probably my favorite horror movie of the year. There are a few coming out in the next couple of months with the likes of Weapons and Together, which could potentially top this. But for now, this one is sitting in the top tier category and is my favorite. So, there you have it, a breakdown of Bring Her Back. If you want to see more of your favorite movies from this year being broken down, then check the playlist below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future videos. What did you think of this movie? Share your thoughts in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.